Hello and welcome to You've Seen It Before, movie reviews with connections in mind, and welcome back to my reaction series to each and every episode of Season 2 of Star Trek Discovery. And if you're new to the series, this is just a short-form video series that I started to give my thoughts on each episode as they came out, as well as some analysis as to where you may have seen certain plot developments or character arcs before in movies or TV shows that have come out prior to this. So, with that in mind, and with all that said, without further ado, let's get into Season 2, Episode 4 of Star Trek Discovery, entitled An Obol for Charon. This episode picks up pretty much where we left off in the previous episode, where the Discovery is in pursuit of Spock's shuttle, which he hijacked after escaping from the psychiatric institution on Starbase 5. However, the Discovery is interrupted in their pursuit by a large spherical entity in space that holds the Discovery in place and disrupts all their systems and creates a lot of havoc aboard the ship, in the form of somehow its influence is affecting Commander Saru and triggering a biological function in his species that basically means he's going to have to die because of it. And also, because of all the havoc with the computer systems aboard Discovery, because of this entity, Ensign Tilly and Commander Stamets and the mechanic from the USS Hiawatha that they rescued in the first episode of this season are all stuck in engineering with the alien entity from the mycelial network, which was communicating with Tilly using the persona of May, and this entity is now reattached itself to Ensign Tilly, and it's up to Stamets and this engineer to try to get the entity off of Tilly, but also try to communicate with the entity in order to figure out how to what is exactly its purpose is in all of this. Now, some parallels that I saw in this episode. First of all, the fact that this entity has arrived at a certain point in time in order to die, essentially, is very similar to an episode of Star Trek The Next Generation entitled Tin Man, where another space life form encounters a starship and is intending on dying by orbiting a dying star, and it'll be consumed by a giant explosion. And its last, both this space entity in Discovery and Tin Man in Next Generation, their last acts in the episode is to fling the starship, either the Enterprise in Next Generation or Discovery in this episode, out of harm's way when an explosion occurs, killing that entity. And that is similarity to that. Also, this space life form having a biological influence on a member of the crew, namely Commander Saru, is very similar to an episode of Star Trek Voyager called Elogium, in which a cloud of space-dwelling life forms has a biological effect on Kes, which is prematurely activating her species' mating ritual or whatever, and at that point she has to conceive, or she will never be able to have children again. However, that was a false Elogium at that point, and that ends up Kes pretty much just goes back to being the way she was after that episode. However, in Discovery, we see that the influence of the space entity on Saru essentially changes Saru by removing his threat ganglia, and now he is no longer based on fear at this point, and as he thought his species was dependent on this whole time. So that's a further development in Saru's character arc at that point. So a different but interesting parallel nonetheless. And finally, the fact that the space entity uses the Discovery's computer systems to try to communicate, and because its communication system is so advanced, not only is it wreaking havoc on these computer systems, but its actions can be perceived as an attack Very similar, in fact, to an episode of Stargate SG-1 known as Entity, in which a machine life form infiltrates the SGC computer system and tries to, and communicates with the base personnel, but its actions are perceived as threatening, and its machine language is so advanced that it will crash the system at that point. So those are just some main parallels that I noted in this episode. I'm sure there are others out there, other examples that I didn't mention or may have forgotten. What did you see? Let me know in the comments down below. But overall, this episode, it was definitely some interesting twists and turns in this. Even though there were some familiar elements in this episode, I liked where how they were developing the characters as they were going on, especially delving into the relationship between Michael Burnham and Saru. Since we already had essentially an established relationship in the pilot episode of the series, and they developed more of a rapport throughout season 1, and now season 2 we get an even deeper development of their interpersonal relations, and I found that was very interesting. As well as I like where they're taking the direction of Ensign Tilly being a central focus as how she's going to be interacting with this persona from the mycelial network, taking on the persona of May, and the interesting development of I like the direction now they're going to explain why the spore drive now has a deleterious effect on this life form, or so they claim. So that's could be a good way of how they're going to explain their way around why there's no spore drives in Star Trek the original series, why Starfleet wasn't using all of those. So we'll see how they explain through that. So that would be an interesting connection to go through. The one thing I didn't really like about this episode was how, well, I thought that their explanation of digital antibodies to try to fight the virus of the alien entity was a little silly. I mean, you could just say firewall, everyone will understand that, but digital antibodies just sounds weird. I mean, that could just be me. I don't know. I don't know as much about computer science. Maybe someone actually uses something called a digital antibody. Who knows? I certainly don't. If you do actually know someone who does use those, correct me in the comments below. I look forward to that. Also, the fact that I found an interesting dilemma when Saru is essentially on his deathbed and he's asking Michael Burnham to cut off his threat ganglia and end his life peacefully. I guess that it was sort of explained when they said that, when Saru said that everything that his people believed was a lie, but it wasn't entirely explained as to whether when the threat ganglia fell off, whether that was due to the effects of this alien entity, where the alien entity potentially changed its anatomy in order to make that possible, or it is in fact a lie from his people, and their threat ganglia aren't necessarily a vital part of their anatomy at that point. I don't think that was as well explained. Maybe I missed it. I don't know. But to me, it sounded like there may have been a little bit of plot hole in the way they wrote it, because it seems like removal of threat ganglia equals death, and that didn't happen, and their explanation as to why that didn't happen was not necessarily communicated in the best way. It wasn't very clear as to why that was possible. So I feel like that may be a little bit of a plot hole. I don't know. So those are my main criticisms of this episode. I am looking forward to the next episode, where we see that the crew's now going to try and rescue Tilly from, I guess, the other world of the mycelial network where she has been abducted to. However, judging by the preview of next week's episode, it looks very much like Tilly's been sucked into the Upside Down from Stranger Things. I'm just going to put that out there right now. I'm calling it right here and right now. We'll see what happens next week. So those are my thoughts. Thank you so much for watching. What did you think of this episode? Did you like it? Did you not like it? What about my analysis? Do you agree, disagree? Did I miss anything? Let me know in the comments down below. Be sure to check it for my episode reaction for next week's episode of Discovery when that comes out. There was no new episode of The Orville this week, but be sure to look for my next reaction video for season 2 of The Orville as well, which will be coming out next week. And also look for my movie review of the Lego Movie Part 2 coming out this weekend once I get to see the movie and do a review for that. So look for all these things. Thank you so much for watching. I appreciate whatever audience I can get. You guys are great, and you're such a wonderful audience. But just remember, there is nothing new under the sun, and yes, you have seen it before.